Hi, everybody. This is Gareth Taylor here, and a really warm welcome to AtlanTec 2021. We're starting off our cyber track this morning at 11:30, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So, just to point out that we'll take questions and answers through the chat during the session, so feel free to drop them in there as we go. I'll be keeping an eye on those as your moderator, and we'll pick them up and put them in at the end. So as we head into today's session, I just want to say a big thank you to all of our sponsors, particularly our main sponsors for 2021. AtlanTec is a free virtual conference this year, free for everybody to join. And that is very much in part to the generosity of all our sponsors, all of whom are big contributors to us here on the Western Seaboard and technology in the region in general. So a fantastic thank you to all of those. Okay, so with that behind us, it's now just for me to introduce Sarah Armstrong-Smith, who's going to be our speaker this morning. Sarah is Chief Security Advisor at Microsoft. She's a director with over 20 years experience advising C-suite in organizations from business continuity through to cybersecurity and also data protection. So a perfect person to talk to us this morning about how zero trust is the way that we're all going to be securing the future of remote working, and indeed I think of our businesses in general, remote working being such a huge topic over the last year, and even topical this week with all the events that have been happening in the cybersecurity world. So with that, that's it from me until the end, when we'll take the questions and answers. And we're going to pass over to Sarah for what's going to be like a really super talk. So thank you, Sarah. And really looking forward to your talk and our conversation at the end.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. So absolutely delighted to be with you here today, and welcome to the AtlanTec Festival. So today we're going to have a conversation about zero trust, and it's really, what is it, what it isn't, and why are we talking about it? Why is it so important given the current climate? So I'm going to jump straight into it about, why are we having this conversation about zero trust? It may feel like a bit of a buzzword, but actually the principles behind it are really important. And I just want to start off with what's changing, what in our current environment. And I think it's fair to say, when we think about security and we think about our network and our perimeter, it used to be very neat, it used to be very easy. It used to be, everything used to be on premise, on our own data center, and our service rooms. We had control over what was going on. And over time, that has continued to build. The perimeter is no longer as we expect. We think more bring your own device. We have people working remotely, multiple different service applications. And really, attackers are taking advantage of this. And it's really evolving into the majority of attacks normally start with some kind of phishing attack, credential theft. But actually, really, when you think about, attackers will really utilize any which way possible into your network. So although the vast majority of attacks still start with credential theft, actually they're looking for any vulnerability, insecure configuration, vulnerabilities in your networks, exposed devices, credentials, those type of things. And it's really about getting that foothold into your network. And then what happens next? Well, some of them are just opportunists, but as we're seeing with the different types of attackers that we're seeing, is actually they need to keep elevating. They need to keep elevating privilege to get access to those admin accounts and laterally move across your network, maybe moving from that on-prem environment into the cloud, into that multi-cloud environment. And really, what's the objective? What are they trying to do? Well, the majority of the cases, they're trying to get access to that data, potentially exfiltrating that data with some kind of ransomware attack, but potentially also collecting data through espionage. And then we think about the changing risk profile, and it has obviously escaped us that we've been living through a global pandemic over the last 12 to 18 months. And that's really changed the risk profile in a number of ways, not just because we have more people working remotely. And at the early days of the pandemic, it was very much about availability. How do we get people up and running as quickly as possible? How do we stay in communication with our employees, our consumers? But also we have to be mindful of the increased stress that people are under when they're trying to work. They've got homeschooling, and they've got the dogs woofing in the background, new processes and all of these things. And again, the attackers are taking advantage of that, and they follow the news of the day, and they're really exploiting what's going on in that current environment. So really, what next? And I think, again, many companies have had to rethink their business models. They've had to change the way they work, the way that they operate, and really introduce new ways of working. And it's really what happens next. What happens after the pandemic? Do people go back to the way that they were working? Do they evolve, continue to evolve, or do they kind of have this halfway round where it's somewhere in the middle, this hybrid way of working? But I think that's interesting is those demands are really being driven by consumers and being driven by your employees in terms of what they want and how they want to work, how they want to operate. But I think as well, when we're talking about these evolving business models, some of these are being generated through marketing, through business leaders, and really is security really keeping up with all of these things. And it's not just security, it's how do we manage that ongoing productivity, the privacy, and also compliance while we're talking through all of these things. And that's really introduced the principles of zero trust. And they really is around principles and design decisions. So let's start with the principles. So the first principle is around verifying explicitly. So if we talk about zero trust, really what it's saying is we shouldn't trust anything until it's verified. So just because somebody has the right credentials, logging on from the right device, right location, how do we know that they are genuinely the bona fide user? So that verification, verifying at all times is really important. The second point is regarding the principle of least privilege. Now, if we think about when we talked around that elevating of privilege and what they're trying to get access to is that admin. So actually, how do we prevent that? Well, at Microsoft, when we think about how does Microsoft protect Microsoft, how do we protect the cloud, if you like? So we have just in time and just enough access, and we do not have open-ended access into the admin or into those environments. So if our administrators need to make a config change, they will look at it and say, this particular task might take 5 minutes, so they're only granted access into the domain for 5 minutes. It's all recorded, and that's what we mean by just in time and just enough. And this assumed compromise is really important as well. Now, we really need to consider that doesn't really matter how good the defenses are, how many tools, how many technologies that we have. That assumed compromise is really important. And if you assume compromise, if you assume that somebody has got access to your network, your device, your data, then you have to kind of ask yourself, so what? What happens next? How high risk, how high impact is this? And what decisions, therefore, do I need to make if I assume that compromise? And this is the kind of the next part, if you like, of that zero trust. It's around the design decisions with regards to architecture. And it really is those architecture decisions. So when I say about what is it and what isn't it, zero trust is not a solution. It's not a product. It's a combination of those principles and those design decisions, as I said. Now, I'm going to be talking about this with regards to these different elements, but the two really important parts that I want you to remember is identity and data. And I'm going to go around that circle, if you like, with regards to some of those design principles and decisions as you go around that clock. But underpinning all of that has to be around being mindful of the user experience and how we enable that productivity. Because if it takes 30 minutes to try and log on, your users are going to get frustrated, they're going to look for workarounds, we introduce the shadow IT, more vulnerabilities, and we just have this whole cycle starts again. So I want to start with identity. And this is really, as we said, about that verification. And I kind of touched on this to a certain extent already. So we're thinking about that perimeter, and we're thinking about how do we connect all of these disparate areas together? So your on-prem world, your cloud environment, your cloud applications, your multiple devices. How do you connect your users, your partners, your customers? Well, the thing that actually brings all of that together is identity. Identity, if you like, is the glue, is the one common factor that joins all of these areas together. Now, in an ideal world, we would recommend a single identity solution. So it doesn't matter, how many cloud services, on-prem environment, whatever you have. Ideally, we'd want one single identity solution to manage and control everything. Now, that might not always be possible. You might have legacy identity solutions, but it really, as we said, the glue that joins everything together is that ability to control from the cloud. Now, we think about, some of the issues that people have. We're trying to remember different passwords and different credentials for different services. Really, what we want to promote as much as possible is that single sign-on from that single identity. And when we talk about verification, having multi-factor authentication is absolutely critical. Now, we always say 100% of users 100% of the time, and actually deploying multi-factor authentication can actually stop 90% of credential attacks. But it's really about managing the risk and having those smart policies and being dynamic to what's going on. And as I sort of said, it's really around enforcing that principle of least privilege. And what are we trying to do with this architecture and these decisions? Well, we've really gone past this just allow or deny. So what we're trying to understand, as we sort of said, is to understand what's going on, the behavior of the user, of the device, and what is normal behavior for that user in that environment. So you're collecting signals, if you like, and trying to understand what's normal. So in the current environment, it might be normal for your user to be working from home, maybe 9 till 5, Monday to Friday. They may have a corporate device. You may have enabled them to have their own device. Now it's really understanding not just the access and the devices, but what they're doing past that. What is typical with regards to, do they normally look at their email in the morning? Maybe they'll go and read the news on the intranet. They might go to look at a few applications and services. So what's normal? And all of this really is about managing risk and how much risk are we prepared to take? And this is where that verification comes into play. So if everything looks normal, and it's low risk, we're going to allow access. We're going to allow access into those applications and services. But let's consider if something changes. Let's consider what happens when your users start to change their behavior. And it can be quite innocent. So maybe they're going back into the office, they stop off at Starbucks on the way, they utilize Starbucks Wi-Fi to access their email. Like, hang on a minute, this is different. This is new behavior. We need that verification. And again, we might just enable that MFA just to make sure, is it really them? And then the second choice that we might have is to limit the access that they have. So we may allow them to view their emails, but we may not allow them to download, to print, to respond. And really, it's really high risk. So one of the things that we might talk about is impossible travel. So how can you be logging on from Ireland and from the USA at exactly the same time? So you're like, hang on a minute, this seems to be a compromised device, a compromised user, and we can block access completely as one of the choices, or quarantine the user or quarantine the device. And this is where we then get into the how do we manage zero trust from a device perspective. And there's a couple of parts to that. So one of that is around looking at the health of the device. Is it running? It's the right operating systems? Is there any malware on it? And it may be so that device has been compromised. And how do we restrict or control the access from those devices? And again, it's that reinforcement of those security policies. So just to give you an example here, you're probably used to having endpoint managers on devices. Now, really what you're then looking for is to be able to look into that device and look at the operating system that's been deployed. Is there any signs of malicious applications or malware? Is there any compromised email devices? And it's really, again, looking at how high risk is the device, not just the user who's logged in that device. And again, we have decisions. So do we allow access? Do we enforce that MFA? Do we force enrollment of that device before they're allowed to access any corporate applications? Now, the interesting thing is, we're not just blocking access. One of the decisions that we could have is to actually force an update onto that device or wipe the device completely if we feel that device has been compromised. Now, I'm going to imagine your users are not going to be quite too happy if you remotely wipe all of their devices, particularly as they have their own applications and data. So there's two choices really, particularly when you're thinking about that bring your own device and that device management. So one of the choices is you enroll the entirety of the device and you control that device and you can send those updates and do that remote wipe, as we sort of said. The second choice is actually just to control the application layer and have those managed applications. And this enables the user to maintain access to their own applications, their own data, and that's controlled in their own way. But actually, if you want to just control the access to the applications, and there's some issues with regards to the device or the health of that device, then you might want to block just the access to the applications, but the device itself is still usable to those users. And then we get into applications themselves. Now, really, there's two parts to this. So the first thing we want to understand is what applications do we have? Now, the average company probably has upwards of over 100 different cloud applications. And as we sort of said, how many unsanctioned applications are there? If people are able to just download things off the internet, how do you know that what's licensed, who's got control? How do you prevent that upload or download of data? But also when they're in the application as well, how do we verify what they're doing? Does that behavior start to look a bit risky? And again, this is where we can start controlling the access to applications. And if we think about it again from those difference between the managed and unmanaged device and the identity solution that sits behind it. So if it's a corporate device, everything looks normal. The user is trying to access highly sensitive data, perhaps maybe from using a HR application. They might be looking at their payroll or whatever they're trying to do. And you might kind of say, oh, well, if it's a managed device, we're going to allow them that full access. They can download, they can view what they like. But if it's an unmanaged device, we might restrict or block the access. And that's really just preventing the exfiltration of data or that download onto devices or unsanctioned devices. But it really goes beyond that. As we sort of said, it's then looking into the application and look at the changes of behavior. So are they trying to view or edit things that they wouldn't normally do? Are they trying to access things? Are they trying to download more things? And this can be, again, a sign potentially of risky behavior, and it goes into a big feedback loop with regards to that verification, and you can set those controls. So it might be actually, maybe we need to set an alert to our security operations team for that investigation, or maybe we're that kind of middle ground with regards to the type of risk, how high risk. Do we need, again, to verify the user's identity and what they're doing? Do we need to monitor what they're doing with those applications in that data in case we need to take more action? But it's all dynamic, it's all reacting to what is going on at the time. Now, I'm going to talk about infrastructure and networks, and the principles around infrastructure and networking is very, very similar. But to illustrate why this is so important, I just wanted to take a few minutes to give you some feedback and lessons learned from some of the recent attacks, nation state attacks, and also ransomware attacks. And these are very much around human operated attackers. So when we think about SolarWinds, when we think about the Exchange server, on-premise attacks, the thing that's quite interesting for these type of attacks is that the attackers chose to start their attack from an on-premise environment. Now, you could argue that if they started in the cloud service provider typically has more telemetry signals, more visibility to what's going on. So with these type of attacks, they've started in that on-premise environment, and they kind of have choices. Do they sit there and risk being potentially being hidden? They can look around the network, they can do their exfiltration, or do they laterally move into the cloud environments, cloud applications, and potentially risk being seen? But this assume compromise mentality is really important, because they're looking for where those vulnerabilities are, and it just happens to be some of these vulnerabilities were an unpatched, unsupported infrastructure that was exposed to the internet. So really, again, what we're trying to think about is how do we segment that infrastructure and that network? And we know many customers, as we said, are still operating in on-premise, a cloud, a multi-cloud, a hybrid environment with multiple different devices. But really what we're trying to avoid is one big open network. I really want to segment that. This becomes really important when you have those out of support, unpatched servers. And we know that's a real challenge for many customers, just with their ability to keep on top of those things. And that's where that segmentation is really important, but also segmentation of those admins as well. So we don't want the same administrator to have access to the on-premise world, to the cloud, because that's how they laterally move. And how do you know you've even been attacked? Now, when we talk about ransomware and those type of attacks, they will spend a lot of time sitting in your network, doing their reconnaissance, learning your defenses to the point where they can exfiltrate that data before they will then ransom part of that network. And its ability, therefore, not just to be able to detect, but also to do that investigation as well. I mean, know certain companies will have really strict requirements for that forensic capability. So it's not just the ability to detect, it's the ability to understand and investigate across that entire network from any of those different points of access. How did they get in? What did they do? What is the impact? Do we actually have to inform users, regulators, and those type of things? So it's always around trying to modernize the infrastructure, modernize the estate, and as much as we can, understanding where those vulnerabilities are, where those weaknesses are in the network, in the infrastructure, and how can we limit the potential for access and that lateral movement across the estate. And as we sort of said, so there's two parts to this really. It's one of it is around that segmentation of the infrastructure and the network, but it's really about them being proactive. So we're not just looking for those threats and reacting to those threats. It's really understanding where those vulnerabilities are. And again, we were talking before about those misconfigurations, those vulnerabilities. How can we proactively fix those servers, those resources, and limit the probability of an actual threat manifesting itself? So the two go hand in hand from a governance and compliance perspective. But it's really about that real-time threat monitoring and looking at those anomalies. And this is where if we assume that compromise, and if we assume we cannot stop all the attacks, then it's really about the detection, and it's really about speed of that detection and reacting to that as quickly as possible, and having those alerts and really being able to automatically block those known threats as much as possible. But this is really where that automation, that orchestration layer comes into play. And it's not just the detection, it's the response. And every year, Microsoft regularly does pulse surveys across different CISOs, different security leaders to understand where those challenges are. And it really is about speed is of the essence. But there's two parts to this. So even what we're talking today is about cybersecurity, and it's about the vulnerabilities across the entirety of the estate. But it actually, when we're talking about the cyber response, we're not just talking about it from a cyber perspective. Now, when we talk about things like ransomware, when we talk about these type of attacks, it's highly likely that if you're having to make decisions to shut down parts of the network, to quarantine users or devices, there's going to be some kind of business impact to that. So you actually have to respond quickly, and particularly when we're talking about ransomware, then you have to be able to have confidence in that backup and the immutability of the backup to make sure that those backups haven't been compromised. And part of what's going on with these different attackers is they're learning our defenses, and they're learning actually how we respond to some of these attackers. Hence why the kind of the business continuity, the crisis management response is just as important as we're sort of going through that. And the network is very much the same in terms of that segmentation, understanding and monitoring the threats, but also looking at what kind of encryption may be required while that data is in transit or at rest. But as I say, the principles of the infrastructure and the network is very similar. And kind of just to end with, if you like, as we sort of said, the two kind of the key important areas is identity and data. So if you assume that compromise through any part of that infrastructure, really what we're trying to then look at is the data, the sensitivities of that data, where that data resides, and how do we protect it. And this is really then, again, thinking about how do you prevent that sharing or oversharing of data while people are working remotely, multiple different devices, collaboration sites, all types of things. So some of the challenges that we see around information protection is really the first point is know your data. And that might sound kind of obvious, but I think we used to only be worried about the difference between structured and unstructured data. But as we've just been talking about, your data could literally be anywhere. And it's like really the understanding with regards to the type of data, the sensitivities of that data, who's allowed access to it, what can they do with that data, and how can we restrict and refine the policies around that data. So do we have to apply additional levels of encryption, access controls, and even data loss prevention? And that data loss prevention is, again, really important. We've gone past just the last point of exit, on email. And really, we're looking at that all through the different applications and services. So potentially, how do we actually stop users from uploading data onto USB sticks, uploading data into things like Dropbox or Google, those type of things. And it's a governance layer and that refining of the policies as we're seeing that. But the data loss prevention, so even if that data has left the organization, the impact is the same. Whether it's an accidental leakage, it's malicious, it's actually an attacker. So the impact is the same in terms of, whether that data has been leakage, whether you then have to tell users, regulators, you have the potential for fines. So hence why we need to kind of assume that compromise, no matter where that compromise is coming from. But actually, we want to be educating people at the same time, and we want to be guiding users. So again, it's not just about blocking their ability to access or download data. We want to be reaffirming why. Why are we asking you not to perform this activity? Why are we asking you to double check the recipient of the data? Why are we asking you not to share credit card or highly sensitive information when you're talking on a Teams chat, for example? And it's reinforcing that behavior, but it's also enabling that productivity as well at the same time. And this is really around, when you understand the sensitivity of the data, you can start making decisions about how that data is protected. Now, to go kind of full circle with what we were talking about with what's changed with the global pandemic and that changing risk profile. Now, a lot of the things that we've been talking about is the external threat. But actually, one of the things we do need to be mindful of is the internal threat. And this has risen quite substantially over the last 12, 18 months. Now, I think it's fair to say the vast majority of people are just trying to do the right thing in a very, very stressful environment. But we do need to look for those indicators of that insider threat and that change of behavior and how we react to that behavior. So the difference between that accidental to a malicious insider is that being able to understand the triggers, the stressors. So potentially, has there been poor performance reviews? Are they at risk of being furloughed? Have they been made redundant? Is there things going on in their home environment that might be a trigger or a stressor? And it's being able to understand the context of all of those things. And as I said, putting it into a big feedback loop in terms of the decisions that we might make, whether we proactively start an investigation, we block certain actions, or we start increasing the monitoring. And this is really what we're trying to do, is be dynamic to that changing situation, enable security and productivity at the same time. And just to finalise before we go into questions, what's the benefit? And I think we sort of talked around, there's zero trust really benefits everybody. So it's on one hand, it's increasing the security, it's reducing the vulnerabilities, the probability of that compromise of users and endpoints. It's about being able to see the big picture, that visibility of the estate, no matter where those compromises are coming from, potentially removing or reducing those blind spots. But when we think about it from the user's perspective and those demands and what's changing, what's going to happen next? Well, really what we're seeing is there's kind of this request, if the desire, if you like, for more flexible working. And that's that ability to work from anywhere, from any device at any time. And to support that enablement of that working, zero trust really is really important as a principle and those design decisions, as we sort of said. But it's really about how do you keep evolving that. Now, in an ideal world, we'd really want to make sure that security and compliance is built in by default, but it sits in the background as an enabler, not a blocker to what we're trying to do. And that's really the core, if you like, with regards to zero trust and why it's so important in the current environment. So I'm going to hand back to Garrett now. Hopefully that's been interesting. I'm sure you've got lots of questions. And